Hi, I'm Natalie. And last month I watched my parents hand over my grandmother's $300,000 inheritance to my brother Dylan at his business expansion party because they said he deserved it more. But that wasn't even the crushing part. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crushing part was discovering they'd been telling everyone I was irresponsible with money while secretly borrowing against their business using my credit as collateral. They thought I'd never find out. They were wrong. I never imagined revenge could taste like morning coffee and spreadsheets, or that justice would arrive in a certified letter on a Tuesday. But sometimes the quietest moves echo the loudest. The Arizona sun was already brutal at 6 in the evening, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn of the Scottsdale Country Club. I pulled my Honda Civic into the valet line behind a parade of BMWs and Teslas, feeling like I'd accidentally crashed the wrong movie premiere. The valet, a college kid with perfectly styled hair, jogged over with a smile that dimmed slightly when he saw my car's faded paint job. I stepped out wearing my best black dress, the one I'd bought for job interviews 2 years ago and had worn to every important family event since. It still fit well, though the fabric had lost some of its original crispness. I smoothed down the skirt and grabbed the small gift bag from my passenger seat, a leather portfolio with Dylan's initials embossed in gold. It had cost me 2 weeks of lunch money, but family milestones deserved thoughtful gifts. The country club's entrance was draped in navy and gold banners announcing Harper Development Group, Phoenix Expansion Celebration. My brother Dylan had been talking about this expansion for months. He'd secured 3 new commercial properties in downtown Phoenix, and tonight was his victory lap. The entire extended family had flown in from California, Nevada, even Colorado. This wasn't just a party, it was a coronation. Inside, the event space buzzed with conversation and the gentle clink of wine glasses. A jazz quartet played in one corner while servers circulated with appetizers that probably cost more per plate than I spent on groceries in a week. The lighting was warm and golden, casting everyone in their most flattering angles. Women in designer dresses air-kissed each other while men in tailored suits discussed golf handicaps and market projections. I spotted my parents immediately. Mom, Diane, was holding court near the bar, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her navy dress clearly new and expensive. Dad, Gary, stood beside her in a charcoal suit I'd never seen before, his chest puffed out with pride as he gestured broadly while talking to Uncle Richard. They looked like they belonged here, comfortable and confident in this world of country club elegance. Dylan appeared at my elbow before I'd made it halfway across the room. He looked every inch the successful businessman in his perfectly fitted navy suit and crisp white shirt. His hair was styled with just enough product to look effortless, and his smile had that practiced charm he'd perfected over years of client meetings and networking events. "Nat, you made it," he said, pulling me into a quick hug. His cologne was expensive and subtle, the kind that whispered success rather than shouting it. "I wasn't sure you'd be able to get away from work." There it was, the gentle implication that my marketing coordinator job at a mid-sized firm was somehow more demanding or inflexible than his position running his own company. I'd requested the afternoon off 2 weeks ago specifically for this event. But Dylan had a way of making everything sound like I was barely managing my responsibilities. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, handing him the gift bag. "Congratulations on the expansion. This is really incredible." Dylan accepted the gift with a gracious smile, but set it aside without opening it, already distracted by someone waving at him from across the room. "Thanks, sis. Hey, make sure you grab some food. The salmon is amazing. I need to go say hi to the mayor real quick." And just like that, he was gone, gliding through the crowd like he owned not just the evening, but everyone in it. I watched him work the room, his hand finding the small of Brooke's back as she joined him. She looked stunning in an emerald green dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her blonde hair swept up in an elegant chignon that showed off diamond earrings that caught the light with every turn of her head. I made my way to the registration table, where a young woman with a clipboard and a practiced smile checked my name against her list. "Natalie Harper," I said, and watched as her finger traced down the page before stopping at my entry. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of confusion crossing her features. "Oh," she said, glancing up at me and then back at the list. "You're listed under family seating, but—" She paused, clearly uncertain about something. "Let me just double-check something." She turned to confer with another staff member, their voices too low for me to catch the conversation. After a moment of whispered discussion and paper shuffling, she returned with a slightly apologetic smile. "I'm so sorry for the confusion. You're at table 12. She handed me a place card with my name printed in elegant script. Table 12. I glanced around the room, noting the round tables draped in crisp white linens, each marked with a small gold number. The head table, clearly visible at the front of the room, was table 1. Tables 2 through 5 surrounded it in a semicircle, obviously reserved for the most important guests. I could see place cards with familiar family names scattered across those prime spots. Table 12 was tucked in the back corner, partially obscured by a decorative column and uncomfortably close to the kitchen doors. As I approached, I could already hear the soft clatter of dishes and the muffled voices of catering staff preparing for dinner service. The other seats at my table were occupied by people I didn't recognize, business associates or distant acquaintances, judging by their polite but distant conversations. I settled into my chair and surveyed my table setting. Everything was perfectly arranged, gleaming silverware, crystal glasses, and a cloth napkin folded into an intricate design that looked like a small flower. But something felt off about the spacing. The settings seemed cramped together, like an extra chair had been squeezed in at the last minute. The centerpiece, a modest arrangement of white roses and baby's breath, was smaller than the elaborate displays I could glimpse at the other tables. From my vantage point, I had a clear view of the kitchen doors, which swung open every few minutes as servers emerged with trays or disappeared with empty plates. The constant motion was distracting, and the brief glimpses of the industrial kitchen, beyond, all stainless steel and focused efficiency, felt jarring against the elegant atmosphere of the dining room. But I could also see the head table perfectly. Dylan sat in the center like a king holding court, with Brooke radiant beside him. Mom and Dad flanked them, their faces glowing with unmistakable pride. Aunt Patricia and Uncle Richard occupied the seats of honor to their left, while Dylan's business partners and their spouses filled out the rest of the table. Everyone was animated, leaning in to share stories and laughing at jokes I couldn't hear from my distant perch. The woman sitting next to me, a brunette in her 50s wearing a burgundy dress, leaned over with a friendly smile. "I'm Carol from the Phoenix Chamber of Commerce. How do you know Dylan?" "I'm his sister," I replied, watching her expression shift to surprise. "Oh." She glanced toward the head table and then back at me, clearly trying to reconcile the family connection with my placement at table 12. "How wonderful! You must be so proud." I nodded and smiled, the practiced response I'd perfected over years of similar conversations. "Absolutely. He's worked incredibly hard for this." Carol seemed to sense the slight awkwardness but was too polite to press further. She turned to include the gentleman on her other side in our conversation, something about commercial real estate trends, and I found myself half listening while observing the dynamics playing out across the room. A server appeared at my elbow, with a tray of champagne flutes, and I gratefully accepted one. The champagne was excellent, crisp and clean with tiny bubbles that danced on my tongue. I sipped it slowly, trying to settle into the evening and shake off the weird feeling that had been building since I arrived. That's when I noticed the photo display. Along the far wall, someone had arranged a series of large framed photographs. chronicling Dylan's journey from childhood to business success. I could see them clearly from my seat: images of him as a little league player, high school graduation, college acceptance letter, first apartment, early business meetings, and recent project completions. The display was professionally mounted with elegant lighting that made each photo look like a museum exhibit. I studied the images, searching for familiar moments from our shared childhood. There was Dylan's 8th birthday party at Chuck E. Cheese, but the photo had been cropped to focus solely on him blowing out the candles. I remembered being in that picture, wearing a purple party dress and standing right beside the cake. There was his high school graduation, but again, the framing excluded the family group shot I distinctly remembered posing for. One photo in particular caught my attention: Dylan's college going-away party in our parents' backyard. I remembered that day vividly because I'd spent hours helping Mom prepare food and decorating the patio with streamers and balloons. But, in the displayed photo, the image was cropped to show only Dylan surrounded by his friends, completely eliminating the corner where I'd been standing with my camera, documenting the whole celebration. It wasn't malicious, I told myself. Photo displays always focused on the guest of honor. It made perfect sense that Dylan would be the center of attention in pictures celebrating his achievements. But still, something nagged at me about the systematic way I seemed to be edited out of the family narrative. The servers began placing salads at each table, and I turned my attention back to my table mates. The conversation had shifted to Phoenix's growing tech sector, and I found myself able to contribute meaningfully thanks to my work with several tech startup clients. Carol and the others seemed genuinely interested in my perspectives, and for a few minutes I felt like I belonged at this table, even if it wasn't where I'd expected to be seated. Then the lights dimmed slightly, and a microphone squeaked to life at the front of the room. Dylan stood up, looking comfortable and confident, as he adjusted the mic stand. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The room gradually quieted, conversations trailing off as everyone turned their attention toward the head table. "Good evening, everyone," Dylan began, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate this incredible milestone with me and Brooke." Applause rippled through the room, and I found myself clapping along, genuinely happy for my brother's success despite the evening's awkward moments. "When I started Harper Development Group 5 years ago," Dylan continued, "I had a vision of creating spaces that would help Phoenix grow and thrive. Tonight, with the announcement of our downtown expansion, I feel like we're finally making that vision a reality." More applause, and I could see Mom wiping away a tear of pride. Dad's chest was practically bursting with joy as he gazed up at his successful son. "But I couldn't have done any of this without the incredible support of my family," Dylan said, gesturing toward the head table. "My beautiful wife, Brooke, who's been my partner in everything. My parents, Gary and Diane, who taught me the value of hard work and determination." He paused, and I found myself sitting forward slightly, wondering if he would acknowledge me as well. We hadn't always been close, but we were family, and I'd supported his business ventures in whatever small ways I could. "And I especially want to thank the person who believed in me from the very beginning," Dylan continued, his voice taking on a more emotional tone. "Mom, Dad, your faith in me has been unwavering, and tonight I want to acknowledge that in a special way." Dad stood up, his face beaming as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. The room seemed to hold its breath as he handed it to Dylan with obvious ceremony. Dylan opened the envelope carefully, pulling out what looked like a check. His face lit up as he read it, and he looked back at our parents with genuine emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dylan announced, his voice thick with gratitude, "my parents have just presented me with the most incredible gift, my grandmother's inheritance, which they've decided to invest directly into the Harper Development Group expansion." The room erupted in applause and appreciative murmurs. I felt the blood drain from my face as the words registered. Grandmother's inheritance. The money that was supposed to be split between Dylan and me when Grandma Rose passed away 2 years ago. The inheritance that Mom and Dad had said was tied up in estate issues and would be distributed when the time was right. I gripped my champagne flute so tightly I was surprised it didn't shatter. My grandmother had been very specific in her will. The money was to be divided equally between her 2 grandchildren. I had a copy of that will in my apartment, along with the letter Grandma Rose had written explaining her wishes. She wanted both Dylan and me to have a financial foundation to build our futures. This investment of $300,000, Dylan continued, his voice carrying across the room, will allow us to accelerate our timeline and create even more opportunities for growth in downtown Phoenix. $300,000. The full amount, not half, not a portion, everything. I sat frozen in my chair, my mind reeling as I tried to process what I was hearing. Around me, people continued clapping and nodding approvingly at this display of family support and investment in Dylan's success. I looked toward the head table, searching my parents' faces for some explanation, some sign that this was a mistake or misunderstanding. But Mom and Dad were beaming with pride, accepting congratulations from other family members and basking in the glow of their generous gesture. Dylan raised his champagne glass in a toast. To family, to faith, and to the future of Harper Development Group. The room responded with enthusiasm, glasses clinking and voices joining in the celebration. I mechanically raised my own glass, the champagne tasting like ash in my mouth as I tried to maintain some semblance of composure. As the formal dinner began and conversations resumed around me, I found myself going through the motions, smiling when appropriate, responding to questions, even laughing at jokes, while my mind churned through the implications of what had just happened. My inheritance, the money Grandma Rose had specifically intended for both of us, had been given entirely to Dylan as an investment in his business. The woman next to me, Carol, leaned over with another friendly smile. "What a wonderful family." "Gesture," she said warmly. "Your parents must be so proud of Dylan's success." I managed to nod and smile back. "Yes," I heard myself say, "they certainly are." But inside, a cold realization was settling over me like fog rolling in from the desert. This wasn't just about money or family dynamics or sibling rivalry. This was about being systematically written out of my own family's story, one decision at a time. And as I sat there in the back corner of the room, listening to the continued celebration of Dylan's success and my parents' generosity, I began to understand that tonight was just the beginning of a much larger conversation that was long overdue. 3 of the dinner plates were cleared away as I sat in stunned silence, mechanically moving my fork through the remains of what had probably been an excellent salmon dish. The taste had vanished from my mouth the moment Dylan announced the inheritance gift, leaving everything feeling like cardboard and disappointment. Around me, the celebration continued with renewed energy, fueled by the dramatic gesture and free-flowing wine. I excused myself from table 12, mumbling something about needing the restroom to Carol, who nodded sympathetically. My legs felt unsteady as I navigated through the maze of tables toward the back of the venue. The restroom was mercifully empty, all gleaming marble and soft lighting that should have been flattering, but only served to highlight how pale I looked in the mirror. I gripped the edge of the sink and stared at my reflection. My carefully applied makeup was holding up, but my eyes looked hollow, like someone had reached inside and scooped out everything that used to live there. $300,000. The phrase kept echoing in my mind like a broken record. That money was supposed to change my life, help me maybe put a down payment on a small house, pay off my student loans, have some actual financial security for the first time in my adult life. Grandma Rose had been specific about her intentions when she'd pulled me aside during her last Christmas with us. We'd been sitting on her front porch in Tucson, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold when she'd taken my hand with her papery fingers. "Natalie, sweetheart," she'd said in that gentle voice that always made me feel like the most important person in the world. "I want you to know that when I'm gone, you and Dylan will both be taken care of. Equal shares, because you're both equally precious to me." She'd gone on to explain how she'd worked 2 jobs for 30 years after Grandpa died, saving every penny she could so her grandchildren would have opportunities she'd never had. The inheritance wasn't just money to her, it was decades of sacrifice, of choosing generic groceries over name brands, of darning socks instead of buying new ones, of driving the same car for 15 years because every dollar saved was a dollar that could help us build better futures. A soft knock on the restroom door interrupted my thoughts. "Natalie? Are you okay in there?" I recognized Aunt Patricia's voice and quickly splashed some cold water on my wrists, trying to pull myself together. Patricia was Mom's older sister, and while they looked similar, Patricia had always been the more direct of the two, less concerned with maintaining perfect appearances. "I'm fine," I called back, but when I opened the door, Patricia's expression told me she wasn't buying it. "Honey, you look like you've seen a ghost," she said, stepping into the restroom and letting the door close behind us. "What's wrong?" For a moment, I considered telling her everything. Patricia had always been kind to me, and unlike my parents, she seemed to actually listen when I talked. But something held me back. This was Dylan's night, and airing family financial business at his celebration felt wrong, even if I was the one being wronged. "It's nothing," I said, forcing a smile. "Just a long day at work. I'm probably more tired than I realized." Patricia studied my face for a long moment, her brown eyes, so similar to Mom's but somehow warmer, searching for the truth I wasn't telling her. "Are you sure? Because if something's bothering you, you know you can talk to me." The kindness in her voice almost broke my carefully maintained composure. "Really, I'm okay. I should get back out there before they start the speeches." Patricia nodded slowly, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. "All right, but my offer stands. Anytime you need to talk, you call me." We walked back toward the dining room together, and I was grateful for her steady presence beside me. The lights had been dimmed further, and a small stage area had been set up at the front of the room. Dylan stood behind a podium, shuffling through note cards while Brooke adjusted the microphone height for him. I returned to table 12 just as the evening's formal program was beginning. Dylan launched into a speech about his journey as an entrepreneur, peppered with anecdotes about early struggles and breakthrough moments. He was a natural speaker, comfortable and engaging, and the audience hung on every word. "5 years ago," Dylan said, his voice carrying easily across the room, "I was working out of a converted garage, cold calling potential clients and living on ramen noodles and determination." Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. I had big dreams but very little capital, and there were plenty of people who thought I was crazy to leave a stable corporate job to start my own firm. I remembered those early days differently than Dylan was presenting them. Yes, he'd worked hard, but the converted garage had been Dad's workshop, which Dad had spent weekends renovating specifically for Dylan's use. The ramen noodle period had lasted maybe 6 weeks before Mom started sending over home-cooked meals every few days, and the very little capital had included a substantial loan from our parents that Dylan seemed to have forgotten about in his narrative. "But I had something that made all the difference," Dylan continued, his voice taking on that emotional tone again. "I had a family who believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." The spotlight found our parents at the head table, and Dad raised his hand in a modest wave while Mom dabbed at her eyes with her napkin. The audience responded with warm applause, clearly moved by this display of family support and unity. My parents, Gary and Diane Harper, have been my champions. "From day one," Dylan said, his voice thick with gratitude. "They've supported my dreams, both emotionally and financially, And tonight's generous gift is just the latest example of their incredible faith in what we're building here. More applause, and I noticed several people at nearby tables nodding approvingly. Nothing warmed a crowd like a story of family love and sacrifice, even if the story was missing some crucial details. "I also want to acknowledge my sister Natalie," Dylan said, and my head snapped up in surprise. "She's here with us tonight, and while she chose a different path, working in marketing rather than joining the family business, I know she's proud of what we've accomplished." The spotlight swung toward table 12, and I found myself suddenly illuminated in front of the entire room. I managed a smile and a small wave, but the phrasing of Dylan's acknowledgement stung. "Chose a different path" made it sound like I'd been invited to join Harper Development Group and had declined. The reality was that Dylan had never once suggested I might have a role in his company, despite my marketing background and the fact that I'd helped him create his first business plan and marketing materials. The spotlight moved on, and Dylan continued with his speech, but I was no longer listening. Instead, I was thinking about the pattern I was beginning to see. At every turn, I was being reframed as the family member who was somehow separate, different, less committed to family success. The sister who chose a different path. The one who needed to be seated at table 12 instead of with the immediate family. The one whose inheritance could be redirected because, presumably, I wasn't as deserving or wouldn't use it as wisely. As Dylan wrapped up his speech to enthusiastic applause, I felt my phone buzz with a text message. I glanced down discreetly and saw it was from my friend Chloe Martinez, who worked as a financial advisor at a downtown Phoenix firm. "Hey girl, saw the pics from Dylan's party on your mom's Facebook. Looks amazing. Also, weird question, but did you know your name is on some business loan applications as a guarantor? Saw it cross my desk for credit verification. Just wanted to make sure you knew. Call me." My blood turned to ice water, business loan applications, with my name as guarantor. I stared at the message, reading it 3 times to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. Chloe worked in commercial lending, and her firm handled a lot of real estate development financing. If she was seeing my name on loan documents for businesses I had no connection to, that meant someone had been using my credit and personal information without my knowledge. I excused myself from the table again, this time slipping outside onto the country club's patio. The desert air was finally cooling down as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, and I welcomed the silence after the constant buzz of conversation and clinking glasses inside. I called Chloe immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. "Natalie." Chloe's voice was warm but concerned. "I was hoping you'd call. Listen, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but I've seen your name pop up on 3 different loan applications in the past 6 months. All for substantial amounts, all related to commercial real estate development." "What kind of amounts?" I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. "We're talking 6 figures each," Chloe said quietly. "And honey, if you didn't sign these documents yourself, you need to know that someone is using your credit profile to secure major business financing." I leaned against the patio railing, the decorative ironwork cool under my palms. "I never signed anything. I don't even know what specific loans you're talking about." "That's what I was afraid of," Chloe said. "Look, I can't give you specifics over the phone because of privacy regulations, but I strongly recommend you request copies of your credit report first thing Monday morning. If someone is using your identity for loan guarantees, you need to document everything and potentially file fraud reports." We talked for a few more minutes, with Chloe explaining the basics of what I should look for and how to protect myself. After I hung up, I stood on the patio for a long time, watching the lights of Phoenix twinkle in the valley below while my mind raced through the implications. Someone in my family had been using my personal information to secure business loans. Given Dylan's speech about early capital challenges and tonight's discussion of expansion financing, it wasn't hard to guess who that someone might be. But the scope of it, multiple loans, substantial amounts, 6 months of activity, suggested, "This wasn't a one-time emergency decision. This was systematic." I thought about Grandma Rose's inheritance again, but now with a different perspective. Maybe the money hadn't been tied up in estate issues for 2 years. Maybe it had been liquid all along, and my parents had been looking for the right moment to direct it where they thought it would do the most good. And maybe they'd been using my credit profile to help Dylan secure the additional financing he needed for his expansion, assuming I'd never find out or that I wouldn't object if I did. The patio door opened behind me, and Mom stepped outside, her navy dress rustling softly in the evening breeze. "There you are," she said, her tone carrying that particular mix of concern and mild annoyance she'd perfected when I was a teenager. "People have been asking where you went." I turned to face her, studying her expression in the soft glow of the patio lights. She looked elegant and composed, every inch the proud mother celebrating her successful son's achievements. But now I was seeing her differently, wondering what she knew and when she'd known it. "I needed some air," I said simply. "Well, you're missing the best part," Mom said, stepping closer and smoothing an invisible wrinkle from my dress with that automatic maternal gesture. "Dylan's business partners are talking about the expansion plans, and there's going to be a toast with the whole family." "The whole family," I repeated, and something in my tone made her pause. "Of course," she said, but her eyes were watchful now. "You're part of this celebration too, Natalie. Dylan made sure to acknowledge you in his speech." "He did," I agreed. "He said I chose a different path." Mom's smile flickered slightly. "Well, you did. You went into marketing instead of joining Dylan's business. There's nothing wrong with that choice." "I was never invited to join Dylan's business," I said quietly. "Oh, honey," Mom said with a laugh that sounded forced. "You know Dylan would have welcomed you if you'd shown interest, but you've always been more independent, more separate from family enterprises." There it was again, the subtle reframing of my exclusion as my choice, my independence as a character flaw that justified being treated differently. I wondered if Mom even realized she was doing it, or if the rationalization had become so automatic that she believed it herself. "What about Grandma Rose's inheritance?" I asked, watching Mom's face carefully. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. "What about it?" "She intended for Dylan and me to split it equally." "And you will," Mom said smoothly, "when the time is right. Tonight was about giving Dylan the resources he needs for this expansion opportunity. Your grandmother would have understood that sometimes family money needs to be deployed strategically." "Deployed strategically," I repeated, "like a business investment rather than a personal inheritance." Mom's smile was beginning to look strained. "Natalie, I hope you're not going to make tonight about money. This is Dylan's celebration, and your father and I made a decision we felt was best for the family as a whole." "Best for which family?" I asked. "Because it seems like some family members get strategic investments while others get strategic exclusions." For a moment, Mom's polished facade cracked, and I saw something harder underneath. "I don't know what's gotten into you tonight, but this attitude is exactly why your father and I felt Dylan was the better choice for managing substantial family resources right now." The words hit like a physical blow. There it was, the real, a truth underneath all the gentle reframing and strategic deployment language. They didn't trust me with money. They thought Dylan was more deserving, more responsible, more worthy of Grandma Rose's decades of sacrifice. "I see," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "And what about the business loans that have my name on them as guarantor?" Mom's face went completely blank for a fraction of a second before the polished expression snapped back into place. But that fraction of a second told me everything I needed to know. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice had lost its warm, maternal tone and taken on something cooler and more defensive. "Commercial real estate loans," I continued, watching her carefully. Multiple applications over the past 6 months, six-figure amounts, all with my personal information used as collateral. Mom was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically see her calculating her response. When she finally spoke, her voice was crisp and matter-of-fact. "Family members sometimes help each other with financial applications," she said. "It's not unusual for adult children to be listed on family business documentation. Without their knowledge or consent?" "Oh, Natalie," Mom said with that dismissive laugh again. "Don't be so dramatic. These are family matters, and sometimes family requires flexibility and trust." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the patio door opening again. Dad stepped outside, his face flushed with wine and celebration, his suit jacket unbuttoned and his tie loosened slightly. "There are my girls," he said warmly, seemingly oblivious to the tension crackling between Mom and me. "What are you doing out here? Dylan's about to make another toast, and he specifically asked for the whole family to be together for it." "We were just coming in," Mom said quickly, her social smile sliding back into place. "Natalie needed a moment of fresh air." Dad looked at me with the slightly unfocused attention of someone who'd been enjoying the open bar. "You feeling all right, kiddo? You've seemed a little quiet tonight." "I'm fine, Dad," I said. "Just processing everything." "It's a lot to take in," he agreed, clapping me on the shoulder with paternal affection. "Your brother's really made something of himself. We're so proud of both our kids, but tonight is really Dylan's moment to shine." Both our kids. The phrase should have been inclusive, but somehow it felt like another gentle reminder of the hierarchy. Dylan was the one making something of himself, the one having his moment to shine. I was just the other kid, the one they were proud of in a general, obligatory way. We walked back inside together, the warm air and soft lighting of the country club wrapping around us like an expensive embrace. The crowd had reorganized itself around the stage area, where Dylan stood with a fresh champagne flute, waiting for everyone to gather. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dylan called out, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Before we wrap up this incredible evening, I want to make one more toast, but this time, I want my whole family up here with me." There was warm applause as Mom and Dad made their way to the stage, followed by Brooke, who moved with the practiced grace of someone comfortable being in the spotlight. They arranged themselves around Dylan like a picture-perfect family portrait, all smiles and expensive clothing and obvious affection. "Natalie?" Dylan called out, looking directly at me with an expectant smile. "Come on up here, sis." Every eye in the room turned to me, and I felt that familiar flush of being suddenly, uncomfortably visible. There was no graceful way to decline without causing a scene, so I made my way to the front of the room, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor in what felt like an unnaturally loud rhythm. I joined the family grouping on stage, positioning myself slightly behind and to the side, the natural place for someone who was included but not central to the narrative. Dylan raised his champagne flute, and the rest of us followed suit. "To the Harper family," Dylan said, his voice warm with emotion. "To the sacrifices that make dreams possible, to the love that sustains us through challenges, and to the bright future we're building together." The room erupted in applause and raised glasses, and I found myself smiling and nodding along with everyone else, playing my role in the perfect family tableau. But inside, something had fundamentally shifted. The evening had pulled back a curtain I hadn't even realized was there, revealing a family dynamic I'd been participating in without fully understanding. I wasn't the daughter who'd chosen a different path. I was the daughter who'd never been offered the same path. I wasn't independent by nature. I'd been systematically excluded and then blamed for the exclusion. And now, apparently, I wasn't. Even trusted with my own financial identity, which had been quietly leveraged for business purposes I'd never agreed to support. As we left the stage and the evening began winding down, I made polite conversation with extended family members and accepted their congratulations on Dylan's success, as if I'd played a meaningful role in it. But my mind was already working ahead, thinking about credit reports and loan documents and phone calls I needed to make on Monday morning. The drive home to my apartment in Tempe was quiet, the desert highway stretching out before me like a question mark. I replayed the evening's conversations in my mind, hearing new meanings in phrases I'd initially accepted at face value. The inheritance wasn't delayed, it was redirected. My exclusion wasn't accidental, it was intentional. And my family's financial decisions weren't just their business when they involved my personal credit and legal liability. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. But first, I needed to understand the full scope of what had been done in my name and what it was going to cost me to fix it. Monday morning arrived with the kind of Arizona heat that makes the air shimmer like water, but I was already dressed and caffeinated by 7 a.m., sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open and a legal pad covered in notes. The weekend had been a blur of research, phone calls to automated systems, and a growing sense of dread as I began to understand the scope of what had been done in my name. My credit report lay spread across the table like evidence in a crime scene, and in many ways, that's exactly what it was. 3 major loans, each one substantial enough to make my hands shake when I read the numbers. Harper Development Group was listed as the primary borrower on all 3, but my name appeared as personal guarantor, making me legally responsible if the business defaulted. My signature was on file for each application, though I'd never seen the documents before requesting copies on Friday afternoon. The forgeries were good. Not perfect, but good enough to pass casual inspection at a busy lending office. Someone had practiced my signature enough to capture the basic flow and rhythm, though they'd missed the tiny flourish I always added to the final E in Natalie, and the way I crossed my T's with a slight leftward slant. It was the kind of detail only someone very familiar with my handwriting would notice, which meant whoever had done this had access to documents I'd signed legitimately. I thought about all the birthday cards, holiday letters, and family documents I'd signed over the years at family gatherings. How easy it would have been for someone to trace my signature, practice the movements, develop enough muscle memory to reproduce it convincingly. The violation felt almost physical, like someone had stolen pieces of my identity and reassembled them into a person who would make financial commitments I'd never agreed to. My phone rang, interrupting my analysis of loan document number 3. The caller ID showed Vincent Torres, the debt collection specialist Chloe had recommended. I'd left him a voicemail on Friday explaining my situation, and he'd promised to call first thing Monday morning. "Ms. Harper," Vincent's voice was professional but warm, with just enough of an accent to suggest he'd grown up speaking Spanish, at home. "I've been thinking about your situation over the weekend, and I have some thoughts about how we should proceed." Vincent worked for a firm that specialized in commercial debt recovery, but he also handled cases of financial fraud and identity theft. More importantly, Chloe had told me, he was known for being thorough, ethical, and particularly effective at unraveling complex family financial situations. "I need to understand exactly what I'm dealing with before I decide how to respond," I told him, spreading the loan documents in front of me like tarot cards predicting a very expensive future. "Smart approach," Vincent said. "Let's start with the basics. You mentioned 3 loans, all with your signature as guarantor. What are the total amounts we're talking about?" I read him the numbers, my voice steady despite the way they made my stomach clench. Loan 1 is for $450,000. Loan 2 is $600,000. Loan 3 is $375,000. Vincent was quiet for a moment, and I could hear him typing. "So we're looking at approximately $1.4 million in total liability, all secured against your personal credit and assets. And you had no knowledge of any of these applications?" "None whatsoever. I found out about them through a friend who works in commercial lending and happened to see my name cross her desk. And the primary borrower on all 3 is Harper Development Group, which is owned by my brother Dylan. It's his real estate development company." "Family business loan fraud," Vincent said, and I could hear a familiar weariness in his voice. Unfortunately, this isn't as uncommon as people think. Family members assume other family members won't pursue legal action, so they feel safer forging signatures and using relatives' credit profiles. What are my options? Vincent outlined several possibilities, each with different implications and levels of nuclear family destruction. I could file fraud reports with the credit agencies and law enforcement, which would trigger investigations and potentially criminal charges. I could demand immediate repayment of the loans and threaten civil action if Dylan and my parents refused. Or I could try to work out some kind of family agreement to gradually remove my name from the loan documents. What would you do? I asked. Him. Honestly? I'd be tempted to let them hang themselves, Vincent said. If your brother's business is over-leveraged and he's been using family members' credit to stay afloat, he's probably in deeper trouble than these 3 loans suggest. Companies that forge family signatures usually aren't models of fiscal responsibility in other areas. What do you mean? I mean, I'd want to take a very close look at Harper Development Group's overall financial picture before deciding how to proceed. If the business is struggling, those loan payments might start defaulting soon anyway. And if that happens, the lenders are going to come after you for the full amounts. The thought made my mouth go dry. $1.4 million. Even if I liquidated everything I owned, sold my car, emptied my savings account, and worked every day for the rest of my life, I couldn't cover that kind of liability. If Dylan's business failed, it would destroy my financial future completely. How do I find out about the company's financial health? I asked. There are ways, Vincent said carefully. Some of them more legal than others. But if you're listed as a guarantor on major business loans, you actually have some legitimate rights to financial information about the primary borrower. The lenders want to make sure guarantors are informed about payment status and business performance. We talked for another 20 minutes about investigative strategies and documentation I should gather. Vincent also recommended a forensic accountant who specialized in family business disputes, someone who could help me understand the broader financial picture before I made any irreversible decisions. After hanging up, I sat staring at my laptop screen for a long time. The cursor blinked in the search box, waiting for me to type something, but I wasn't sure where to start. How do you investigate your own family? How do you transition from Sunday dinner conversations to hiring professionals to examine your brother's business practices? I started with public records. Harper Development Group was incorporated in Arizona, which meant basic business filings were available through the state's online database. I found the original incorporation documents, the registered agent information, and the annual reports Dylan was required to file each year. The picture that emerged was troubling. Harper Development Group had started strong, with healthy revenues and modest debt levels in its first 2 years. But beginning in year 3, the debt load had increased dramatically while revenue growth had flattened. The company was carrying significantly more liability than assets, and the trajectory was clearly unsustainable without major capital infusions, which explained the loans with my signature. Dylan needed cash to keep the business operational, but his debt-to-income ratio was probably too high for him to qualify for additional financing on his own. By adding me as a guarantor, he could leverage my clean credit history and stable employment to access money he couldn't get independently. It was actually a clever strategy from a purely financial perspective. I had the kind of boring, steady job and conservative spending habits that lenders loved to see. My credit score was excellent, my debt load was minimal, and my income was predictable. On paper, I looked like exactly the kind of responsible person who would carefully evaluate a business investment before committing to guarantee its loans. Of course, that analysis only worked if I had actually agreed to guarantee the loans. My phone buzzed with a text from Dylan. Hey sis, hope you had fun at the party Saturday night. Brooke and I were talking about having you over for dinner soon. To catch up. Miss you. I stared at the message for a long time. Was this genuine affection, or was Dylan sensing that something was wrong and trying to manage the situation? The timing felt suspicious, coming just 3 days after I'd learned about the loans and started asking uncomfortable questions. I typed and deleted several responses before settling on something neutral. Sounds nice. Let me check my schedule and get back to you. The rest of the morning was spent making phone calls and gathering more pieces of the puzzle. I contacted each of the 3 lending institutions to request complete copies of my loan guarantee documents, including all the forms with my alleged signature. I also asked for payment histories, current balance information, and any correspondence they'd had with Harper Development Group about the loans. The first 2 lenders were cooperative, though they required me to fax proof of identity and sign additional forms acknowledging my guarantor status. The third lender was more difficult, insisting they could only discuss loan details with Dylan as the primary borrower. It took a conference call with Vincent Torres to convince them that guarantors had legitimate rights to information about the loans they were backing. By lunchtime, I had a clearer picture of the financial timeline. The first loan had been taken out 8 months ago, right around the time Dylan had started talking publicly about his expansion plans. The second loan was 6 months old, coinciding with his acquisition of the first downtown property. The third loan was only 2 months old, which meant it had been processed just weeks before his celebration party. The payment history was even more concerning. All 3 loans were current, but barely. Dylan was making minimum payments, and on 2 of the loans, he'd requested payment deferrals in recent months. The lenders had agreed to the deferrals because of my guarantor status, but there were notes in the files indicating concern about the primary borrower's cash flow situation. I was studying a particularly damning cash flow analysis when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see a delivery driver holding a large envelope marked Priority Legal Documents. My heart rate spiked as I signed for the package, wondering what fresh crisis was about to unfold. Inside the envelope was a thick stack of papers from a law firm I didn't recognize. The cover letter was addressed to me personally and marked Confidential Attorney-Client Communication. As I read the first paragraph, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet once again. The letter was from Margaret Chen, an attorney representing Grandview Bank, which had apparently issued a 4th loan to Harper Development Group with my name as guarantor. This loan was different from the others, though. It was a line of credit, rather than a term loan, which meant Dylan could draw against it as needed up to a maximum limit. And according to the bank's records, he'd been drawing against it heavily for the past 3 months. The current balance was $850,000, and the line of credit was maxed out. Dylan had apparently been using the money to make payments on the other 3 loans, which explained why they were current despite his cash flow problems. He was essentially juggling debt, moving money between different lenders to maintain the appearance of financial stability. But the Grandview Bank line of credit was now in default. Dylan had missed 2 consecutive minimum payments, and the bank was accelerating the entire balance. They were demanding immediate repayment of the full $850,000, and as the guarantor, I was legally responsible for the debt. The letter gave me 30 days to respond before they began collection proceedings against my personal assets. I set the papers down carefully, as if they might explode if handled roughly. 4 loans, not 3. The total liability wasn't $1.4 million. It was $2.2 million. Dylan had been systematically using my credit profile to keep his failing business afloat, and now that the scheme was collapsing, I was going to be held responsible for debts I'd never agreed to take on. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone to call Vincent Torres. This had moved beyond family drama into serious legal territory. I needed professional help, and I needed it immediately. Vincent answered on the first ring, as if he'd been expecting my call. "What's the latest development, Ms. Harper?" I read him the letter from Margaret Chen, stumbling over some of the legal terminology but managing to convey the essential facts. Vincent was quiet while I talked, but I could hear him typing rapidly in the background. "This changes everything," he said when I finished. With the line of credit in default, you're looking at immediate collection action. The other lenders are going to find out about the default, and they'll probably accelerate their loans too. This could snowball very quickly. What does that mean for me? It means you need to decide right now whether you're going to fight this or try to negotiate some kind of settlement. Because in about 3 weeks, if we don't take action, collection, agencies are going to start seizing your assets to satisfy debts you never agreed to take on. The weight of the situation settled over me like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about my inheritance anymore, or even about family fairness. This was about my entire financial future, my ability to own a home, my credit rating, my capacity to make my own choices about my life and career. Dylan's business problems were about to become my personal catastrophe. I want to fight, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. I want to fight everything. Good, Vincent said, and I could hear satisfaction in his tone. Because I think we can do more than just fight. I think we might be able to turn this whole situation around in your favor, but it's going to require some aggressive strategies and a willingness to make your family very, very angry. I'm ready for them to be angry, I said, thinking about Saturday night's celebration, about Grandma Rose's inheritance being handed over like a business investment, about years of being positioned as the family member who chose a different path. Excellent. Let me make some calls and do some research. I'll have a strategy memo for you by tomorrow morning. In the meantime, don't respond to any communications from your family, and don't sign anything else. We're about to go on the offensive. After hanging up, I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the desert landscape stretching toward the mountains. The heat was making everything shimmer and dance, creating illusions that disappeared as soon as you tried to focus on them. It seemed like an appropriate metaphor for my family relationships, which had apparently been much different from what I'd believed. My phone buzzed with another text, this time from Mom. Natalie, honey, your father and I would like to take you to lunch this week. There are some family matters we should discuss. When works for you? I stared at the message, wondering if they knew about the defaulted loan, if they were trying to manage the crisis before I found out about it, or if this was just coincidental timing. Either way, Vincent's advice was clear. No communications. With family until we had a strategy. I deleted the message without responding and spent the rest of the afternoon organizing all the financial documents I'd gathered. By evening, I had created a comprehensive file documenting every loan, every forged signature, every financial irregularity I'd discovered. It was a thick folder, heavy with evidence of systematic fraud and financial manipulation. As I closed the folder and set it aside, I thought about Grandma Rose and the inheritance money that had started this whole revelation. $300,000 that was supposed to help me build a secure future had instead been redirected to prop up a failing business that was threatening to destroy my financial stability entirely. But maybe, if Vincent Torres was as good as Chloe claimed, there was still a way to turn this situation around. Maybe the very loans that were supposed to ruin me could become the leverage I needed to get justice for years of being treated as a second-class family member. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my small balcony, watching the sun set behind the mountains and thinking about what it meant to go to war with your own family. It wasn't a decision I'd ever imagined having to make, but sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you most need protection from. Vincent Torres arrived at my apartment Tuesday morning carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of sharp navy suit that suggested he took his professional reputation seriously. He also brought coffee from a local roastery and a box of pastries, which told me he understood that difficult conversations went better when people weren't running on empty stomachs and caffeine withdrawal. "Before we discuss strategy," he said, settling into my kitchen chair and opening his briefcase with practiced efficiency, "I need you to understand something important. What we're about to do will fundamentally change your relationship with your family. There's no walking this back. Once we start down this path." I poured myself coffee from the carafe he'd brought and considered his words carefully. Over the past 48 hours, I'd been wrestling with the ethical implications of what I was contemplating. These were the people who'd raised me, who'd celebrated my birthdays and attended my graduation, and theoretically loved me. But they were also the people who'd systematically excluded me from family financial decisions while using my identity to secure millions of dollars in debt without my knowledge or consent. "I've been thinking about that," I said, meeting his gaze directly. "And I keep coming back to the same conclusion. They already changed our relationship when they decided to forge my signature and risk my financial future to save Dylan's business. I'm just responding to choices they already made." Vincent nodded approvingly and pulled out a thick folder marked with my name. "Good, because what I'm about to propose requires complete commitment. Half measures won't work, and if you get cold feet halfway through, you'll end up in a worse position than when we started." He spread several documents across my kitchen table, each one marked with colored tabs and sticky notes. The first document was a forensic analysis of Harper Development Group's finances, prepared by the accountant Vincent had recommended. The numbers were even worse than I'd suspected. "Your brother's company is essentially insolvent," Vincent explained, pointing to a summary chart that showed assets versus liabilities. "He's been using new debt to service existing debt for at least 8 months, which is classic Ponzi scheme behavior. The business generates enough revenue to cover operational expenses, but nowhere near enough to service the debt load he's accumulated." The analysis showed that Harper Development Group owed approximately $4 million across various loans, lines of credit, and supplier agreements. The company's total assets, even if liquidated at fair market value, would cover maybe 60% of that debt, which meant that even if Dylan sold everything and shut down the business, there would still be a substantial shortfall. "And that's where you come in," Vincent continued, flipping to the next document. "As a guarantor on loans totaling $2.2 million, you're legally responsible for any shortfall when the primary borrower defaults. But I never agreed to guarantee those loans." "Correct. Which brings us to our first strategic option, criminal fraud charges." Vincent pulled out what looked like a police report template. "Identity theft, forgery, financial fraud, all felonies in Arizona, all carrying substantial prison sentences. We have clear evidence of systematic criminal behavior, and the dollar amounts involved make this a high-priority case for prosecutors." I stared at the paperwork, imagining Dylan in handcuffs, my parents trying to explain to their friends why their son was facing federal criminal charges. The image should have felt satisfying, but instead, it just felt heavy and sad. "What's the alternative?" "Civil litigation. We sue for damages, demand immediate repayment of all fraudulent loans, and seek punitive damages for the identity theft and financial manipulation." Vincent moved to the next set of documents. "This approach takes longer, but it gives us more control over the outcome and doesn't involve law enforcement." "And the third option?" Vincent smiled, and there was something predatory in his expression that made me sit up straighter. "The nuclear option. We buy their debt and call it due immediately." He explained the concept methodically, like a professor teaching a particularly complex economic theory. Harper Development Group owed money to multiple creditors beyond the RT, 4 loans with my forged signature. There were supplier agreements, equipment financing, even outstanding payments to subcontractors. Many of these smaller creditors were getting nervous about Dylan's ability to pay, especially as rumors about his cash flow problems began circulating in Phoenix's tight-knit real estate development community. Nervous creditors sell debt at significant discounts, Vincent said, especially when they're dealing with a borrower who's showing signs of financial distress. "We could potentially acquire a controlling interest in your brother's business debt for maybe 40 to 50 cents on the dollar." "And then what?" "Then we accelerate everything. Demand immediate payment of the full amounts, initiate foreclosure proceedings on any collateralized assets, and essentially force Harper Development Group into bankruptcy. Vincent leaned back in his chair, watching my reaction carefully. Your brother would lose his business, your parents would lose any money they've invested in it, and you'd be in a position to recover some of your losses through the liquidation process. The scope of what he was proposing took my breath away. This wasn't just about getting my name off fraudulent loan documents or recovering Grandma Rose's inheritance. This was about systematically dismantling my brother's livelihood and potentially destroying my parents' financial security in the process. How much would it cost to buy enough debt to make this work? Vincent consulted a spreadsheet covered in calculations. Based on my preliminary research, we're looking at approximately $600,000 to acquire a controlling position. That would give us leverage over about $1.4 million in total debt, plus the legal right to force liquidation of collateral assets. $600,000. More money than I'd ever had access to in my life, more than my annual salary, more than I could possibly raise through conventional means. I was about to ask Vincent how he expected me to finance this strategy when he pulled out one final document. "Which brings us to your secret weapon," he said, sliding the paper across the table. "Your inheritance." I looked down at the document, recognizing the letterhead of the law firm that had handled Grandma Rose's estate. But this wasn't the will I'd seen before. This was a more recent document, dated just 6 months before her death, with different provisions than what my parents had told me about. I don't understand. My parents said the inheritance was $300,000, split between Dylan and me. That's what the original will specified, Vincent agreed. But your grandmother amended her will shortly before she died. According to this revised version, she left you a much larger inheritance, with very specific conditions about how it could be used. I read through the document slowly, my hands trembling slightly as I processed the implications. Grandma Rose had left me $800,000, not $150,000. But the money came with restrictions. It could only be used for education, starting a business, purchasing a primary residence, or what the legal language described as protecting the beneficiary's financial interests from family interference. She knew, I whispered, looking up at Vincent. Somehow, she knew this might happen. Your grandmother was apparently a very astute woman, Vincent said gently. The revised will includes some interesting language about family members who might attempt to manipulate or exploit her grandchildren. She specifically mentions concerns about business investments and financial decision-making that might not serve your best interests. The final provision in the will was the most revealing. If there was ever a dispute about the inheritance, or if I needed to take legal action to protect my financial interests, the estate would cover all associated legal costs and make the full inheritance amount available immediately for such purposes. She created a war chest, I said, understanding dawning like sunrise after a long, dark night. She gave me the resources to fight back if the family ever tried to take advantage of me. Exactly. And the beauty of this provision is that it's retroactive. If family members have already taken actions that harm your financial interests, you can use the inheritance to remedy those situations. Vincent explained the logistics of accessing the inheritance money. The revised will had been filed with the probate court, but the executor, a bank trust officer rather than a family member, had been waiting for me to make a formal request for the funds. My parents had apparently convinced me that the original will was still in effect, preventing me from ever asking about the larger inheritance. How did you find this? Forensic estate research. When family financial fraud is involved, we always check for undisclosed assets or revised estate documents. Your grandmother's attorney was very cooperative once I explained the situation and showed him evidence of the forged loan documents. I spent the next hour reading through every page of the revised will, marveling at Grandma Rose's foresight and attention to detail. She'd apparently been concerned about what she diplomatically termed the family's tendency to prioritize certain members over others, and had structured the inheritance to prevent exactly the kind of manipulation I'd experienced. By noon, we'd outlined a comprehensive strategy. Vincent would immediately begin negotiating with Harper Development Group's creditors to purchase their debt at discounted rates. Simultaneously, I would file fraud reports with all 3 credit agencies and demand that the forged loan guarantees be removed from my credit profile. We'd also send formal demand letters to Dylan and my parents, requiring immediate repayment of the fraudulent debt and damages for identity theft. The goal is to apply maximum pressure from multiple directions simultaneously, Vincent explained, as we organize the paperwork into actionable files. Your brother can't fight battles on every front at once, especially when his business is already financially unstable. What about my parents? They're not directly liable for the business loans. No, but they received your inheritance money under false pretenses, and they appear to have been aware of the loan fraud. We'll be seeking recovery of the $300,000 plus damages and legal fees. Vincent's expression was professionally neutral, but I could see satisfaction in his eyes. By the time we're finished, they'll wish they'd split that inheritance properly from the beginning. The afternoon was spent making phone calls and signing authorization forms. Vincent introduced me to Margaret Chen, the attorney who'd written the demand letter about the defaulted line of credit. She was also going to handle the criminal fraud referral and coordinate with law enforcement if we decided to pursue charges. The evidence is overwhelming, Margaret said during our conference call. 4 separate instances of signature forgery, systematic identity theft, and financial fraud involving millions of dollars. This isn't a gray area or a family misunderstanding. This is serious criminal behavior. By evening, the machinery of legal and financial warfare was in motion. Vincent had already contacted 6 of Harper Development Group's smaller creditors, and 3 of them were interested in selling their debt immediately. Margaret had prepared criminal referral paperwork that could be filed with federal authorities within 24 hours if we chose to escalate. I sat on my balcony as the sun set, watching the mountains turn purple and gold while sipping a glass of wine and processing everything that had happened. Tomorrow, my family would start receiving formal legal notices that would fundamentally change our relationships forever. There would be no more Sunday dinners, no more holiday celebrations, no more pretending that we were a normal, loving family that just happened to have some minor financial disagreements. My phone buzzed with a text from Dylan. Hey Nat, still. Haven't heard back about that dinner invitation. Brooke's making her famous lasagna this weekend if you want to come over. We miss you. I stared at the message for a long time, wondering if Dylan genuinely didn't know about the loan defaults and legal troubles brewing, or if this was part of some strategy to keep me close while his world fell apart. Either way, by tomorrow morning, subtle dinner invitations would be the least of his concerns. I typed back a simple response. Thanks, but I'll be busy this weekend. Family business matters to attend to. It felt appropriate. After years of being excluded from family business decisions, I was finally going to make some business decisions of my own. And unlike my family's approach, mine would be transparent, legal, and designed to protect my interests rather than sacrifice them for someone else's benefit. Vincent had scheduled a breakfast meeting for Wednesday morning to review the initial responses from creditors and finalize our debt acquisition strategy. By the end of the week, I would either be in control of enough Harper Development Group debt to force the company into bankruptcy, or Dylan would have somehow managed to find $2.2 million to pay off the fraudulent loans and remove my name from all guarantor agreements. Given the forensic analysis of his company's finances, I wasn't particularly worried about the second option. Harper Development Group was a house of cards built on borrowed money and false promises, and I was about to become the wind that brought it all down. The irony wasn't lost on me. Dylan had used my financial reputation and credit history to build his business empire. Now I was going to use Grandma Rose's inheritance and strategic debt acquisition to tear it down. Sometimes justice came full circle in ways you never expected, and sometimes the people who taught you about consequences had to learn about them firsthand. As I finished my wine and prepared for bed, I thought about the family photo on my dresser, taken at last year's Christmas gathering. We all looked so happy and normal, gathered around the tree with forced smiles and coordinated outfits. By next Christmas, that photo would probably be the only evidence that we'd ever functioned as a family unit, back when I still believed in things like loyalty, trust, and the assumption that family members looked out for each other's best interests. But maybe some lessons were worth the cost of learning them, even when that cost was everything you'd believed about the people who were supposed to love you most. 3 weeks later, I stood in the conference room of Vincent's law office watching through the floor-to-ceiling windows as Dylan's BMW pulled into the parking lot below. He sat in his car for several minutes, probably steeling himself for what was about to happen, before finally walking toward the building entrance with the slow, measured steps of someone approaching their own execution. The past 21 days had unfolded with mechanical precision. Vincent had successfully acquired debt from 7 different Harper Development Group creditors at an average cost of 42 cents on the dollar. For just over $500,000 of Grandma Rose's inheritance, we now controlled $1.6 million in business debt, giving us the legal authority to demand immediate repayment and initiate foreclosure proceedings. Margaret Chen had filed the criminal fraud referrals with both state and federal authorities, though she'd held off on pressing charges pending Dylan's response to our civil demands. The message was clear: cooperate with our terms or face potential prison time for systematic financial fraud. The forensic accountant had completed his analysis of Harper Development Group's books, uncovering evidence of additional financial irregularities that went far beyond the forged loan guarantees. Dylan had been systematically inflating project valuations, manipulating cash flow reports, and using client deposits for operational expenses rather than project-specific costs. The business wasn't just failing, it was actively defrauding investors and clients. Most satisfying of all, I'd received confirmation that my inheritance funds had been fully distributed according to Grandma Rose's revised will. $800,000 sat in a new investment account, minus the $500,000 we'd used for debt acquisition and legal fees. After years of being told I was financially irresponsible and undeserving of family resources, I now had more liquid assets than my parents and brother combined. Dylan entered the conference room looking like he'd aged 5 years in 3 weeks. His usual polished appearance was frayed around the edges. His suit was wrinkled. His hair looked like he'd been running his hands through it. And there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. Brooke wasn't with him, which told me their marriage was probably another casualty of his financial collapse. "Natalie," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and something that might have been shame. "I don't understand how this happened. How did we get here?" I remained seated at the conference table, flanked by Vincent and Margaret, while Dylan took the chair across from us like a defendant facing judgment. The symbolism wasn't accidental. For the first time in our relationship, I held all the power, and I wanted him to feel the weight of that reversal. "We got here because you forged my signature on loan documents and used my credit to prop up your failing business," I said, my voice steady and professional. "We got here because you and our parents decided I was too irresponsible to receive my inheritance, while simultaneously risking my financial future without my knowledge or consent." Dylan's shoulders sagged. The business was just going through a rough patch. I was going to pay everything back once the downtown projects were completed and cash flow improved. "Your business has been insolvent for over a year," Vincent interjected, sliding a copy of the forensic analysis across the table. "You've been operating a Ponzi scheme, using new investor money and fraudulent loans to service existing debt. There was never any realistic possibility of repayment." Dylan stared at the financial analysis without picking it up, like it might burst into flames if he touched it. "What do you want from me? I'll sign whatever documents you need to remove Natalie's name from the loan guarantees. I'll work out payment plans with the lenders. Just tell me what you want." "It's too late for payment plans," Margaret said, opening her own folder. 4 of your major creditors have already accelerated their loans and initiated collection proceedings. The other 3 are preparing to follow suit. Your business assets are going to be liquidated whether you cooperate or not. But we can make this process easier for everyone, I added, leaning forward slightly. Or we can make it much, much harder. Vincent explained our terms with the clinical precision of a surgeon describing a necessary amputation. Dylan would immediately sign documents transferring ownership of all Harper Development Group assets to a liquidation trust controlled by our legal team. He would provide complete financial records and client lists to ensure proper notification of project cancellations. Most importantly, he would publicly acknowledge the fraud and take full responsibility for the forgery and identity theft. And, if I refuse? Dylan asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. Then we file criminal charges and let federal prosecutors handle the situation, Margaret said. Identity theft and financial fraud involving millions of dollars typically carry sentences of 10 to 15 years in federal prison. Dylan was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands while the weight of his situation settled over him. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed and desperate. What about Mom and Dad? They didn't know about the loan applications. They just thought they were helping me with a business investment. Your parents knowingly withheld Natalie's inheritance and used it to capitalize your business, Vincent replied. They may not have been directly involved in the loan fraud, but they participated in financial manipulation and breach of fiduciary duty. I pulled out a separate folder containing the demand letter we'd sent to my parents the previous week. They have 30 days to return the $300,000 they gave you, plus interest and legal fees. If they refuse, we'll add them to the civil lawsuit and seek punitive damages. Dylan read through the documents slowly, occasionally asking questions about specific terms or timeline requirements. The fight had gone out of him completely. He looked like someone who'd been holding his breath underwater for months and had finally accepted that he was going to drown. I need to call Brooke, he said eventually. She's going to need to know about the house, the cars, everything we're going to lose. Your personal assets aren't part of this agreement, I said. And Dylan looked up with surprise. We're only interested in recovering fraudulent business debt and removing my name from loan guarantees. What happens to your marriage and personal finances is between you and your creditors. It was a small mercy, but I wasn't completely heartless. Dylan's wife hadn't chosen to forge my signature or steal my inheritance. She'd married a successful businessman who'd hidden the extent of his financial crimes from everyone, including her. She didn't deserve to lose everything because of his bad decisions. Dylan signed the liquidation documents with shaking hands, his signature looking nothing like the confident flourish he'd practiced when forging mine. Margaret notarized each page and handed him copies for his records, though I doubted he'd want to keep souvenirs of his business empire's collapse. There's one more thing, I said as Dylan prepared to leave. I want a written apology, not just acknowledging the fraud, but taking responsibility for years of treating me like a second-class family member. I want you to admit that you and our parents systematically excluded me from family decisions while simultaneously exploiting my financial resources. Dylan looked like I'd asked him to cut off his own arm. Natalie, come on. We're family. Do we really need to make this personal? You made it personal when you decided I wasn't worth consulting before risking my entire financial future, I replied. You made it personal when you let Mom and Dad give you my inheritance while telling everyone I wasn't responsible enough to handle money. You made it personal every time you positioned yourself as the successful child while positioning me as the disappointment. Vincent slid a draft apology letter across the table. It was comprehensive and unflinching, acknowledging not just the financial fraud, but also the emotional manipulation and systematic exclusion I'd experienced for years. Dylan read through it twice, wincing at particularly direct passages. This will destroy our relationship forever, he said quietly. No, I corrected him. Your choices already destroyed our relationship. This just makes it official." Dylan signed the apology letter without further argument. As he stood to leave, he paused at the conference room door and looked back at me with something that might have been regret. For what it's worth, I really did think I'd be able to pay everything back. I never intended for you to get hurt by this. "The road to bankruptcy is paved with good intentions," I said. "And the road to fraud is paved with rationalizations about what you never intended to happen." After Dylan left, Vincent and I spent another hour reviewing the liquidation timeline and discussing the criminal investigation process. The federal prosecutor had agreed to defer charges pending Dylan's cooperation with asset recovery, but any attempt to hide assets or obstruct the liquidation would result in immediate arrest and prosecution. "How long before this is completely resolved?" I asked as we gathered up the signed documents. 6 to 8 months for the business liquidation," Vincent said. "The civil lawsuit against your parents will probably take longer, depending on whether they decide to fight or settle." "And then?" "Then you'll have successfully recovered your inheritance, removed all fraudulent debt from your personal credit, profile and established legal precedent that protects you from future family financial manipulation." Vincent smiled with professional satisfaction. "You'll also have approximately $300,000 in liquid assets and a very clear understanding of your family's true priorities." I drove home through Phoenix traffic that evening, thinking about the conversation I'd need to have with my parents when they received Dylan's signed confession and our updated settlement demand. They'd probably try to frame this as a family dispute that got out of hand, rather than acknowledging the systematic financial abuse and manipulation that had necessitated legal intervention. But their perspective didn't matter anymore. I'd learned that family relationships based on manipulation and exploitation weren't worth preserving, and that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was establish clear boundaries with people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted with your well-being. My phone buzzed with a text from Chloe Martinez, who'd been following the situation since she'd first alerted me to the fraudulent loans. "Saw the news about Harper Development Group filing for liquidation? Everything going according to plan?" I typed back, "Better than planned. Justice served, inheritance recovered, family boundaries established. Thanks for having my back. Always. Dinner this weekend to celebrate?" "Absolutely. I'm buying." For the first time in months, I could afford to buy dinner without checking my bank balance first. More importantly, I could afford to choose my own path forward without worrying about family approval or inclusion in decisions that were made without my input anyway. Grandma Rose had been right to revise her will and create a war chest for fighting family manipulation. She'd understood something about power dynamics and financial control that had taken me years to learn. Money wasn't just about security or comfort. It was about autonomy and the ability to protect yourself from people who might love you, but didn't respect you. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I thought about the family photo on my dresser and decided it was time to put it away. Some chapters of life deserve to be closed with intention rather than left open out of habit or false hope. The inheritance that was supposed to build my future had ended up saving it instead. And sometimes salvation looked exactly like an empty conference room, signed legal documents, and the freedom to walk away from people who'd never really seen you as an equal partner in the first place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories. Right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.